We're now going to move on to our next speaker, and I want to introduce you to the Reverend Canon Dr. Elizabeth Shercliff. Liz, if you'd like to come forward. Liz is Professor of Biblical Studies and Practical Theology at the Martin Luther Centre in Manchester. She has published numerous books and articles, especially on the subject of preaching and the importance of hearing women's voices from the pulpit. So over to you, Liz. Thank you so much.
I have to explain first, it took almost as long to get from Wembley into Euston as it did to get from Manchester to Wembley because there was some security crisis on the train. So I apologise for being late, and I'm sorry I missed Bishop Rosemary's talk. Perhaps I'll catch up. When Martin invited me to do this talk, I didn't for 1 minute think that I'd be doing it in a stormtrooper boot. But breaking my ankle has been quite instructive. It became clear to me at the reception desk at A&E that if you're in a wheelchair, you can't remember your own name. And then it became even more obvious in fracture clinic that if you've broken a bone, it makes you go deaf. We all make rapid, unconscious decisions based simply on the body that we see in front of us. And in a sense, that's what my research was about. The 5 guiding principles make it acceptable to judge and dismiss women preachers just based on body shape. My research was carried out among women training for preaching ministry in the Church of England. And I discovered that patriarchal doctrines and opinions directly impact the ways in which women are taught to preach and are received as preachers. And this, in answer to the question that goes at the top of this talk, does impact the way that the gospel is preached and heard. Mutual flourishing and the 5 guiding principles, although discussed in theological education institutions, have been demonstrably weaponized by those who do not want to see women in church ministry. Mutual flourishing is not only a catchword for not asking difficult questions, it and the 5 guiding principles have become the basis of gaslighting. You're accusing me of bias. I assure you, you're wrong. And in a classic case of Darvo, a director of studies once rang me to say that one of his students was unable to take communion because I was presiding, and what did I want to do about it? I won't tell you the answer. Mutual flourishing is a sexist wound in the side of the church, Gabby Thomas says. And watching Synod last month was ample demonstration of her argument that the 5 guiding principles are a foil for bullying and for cover-up. My focus in my research and in this paper is on preaching. I spent 14 years teaching readers and ordinands about preaching, and I still do teach and write about it. But learning to preach happens in a wider and largely unacknowledged context. A mysterious thing happens during training for ministry. It's called formation. In my experience, it's never fully explained, and it seems to be understood only by the initiates. But I've become increasingly convinced that formation is not an intransitive verb. Formation involves formation, or manufacture, of potential ministers to a set of standards. And these standards include those made specific by the church, but are more than the total of them. Some of the standards to which women preachers in particular are shaped are hidden. They're assumptions based on male normativity. They include how women should preach, what they should say, how they should behave. In learning to preach the gospel, I suggest that women ministers are conformed to ministerial standards through distrusting and invalidating women's voices and the authenticity of women's experiences. The people I'm talking about are about 66 people responded to my research, and then 12 others took part in a conversation day. So when I say women, that's primarily the ones that I mean. Much of the Church of England is shaped by the 5 guiding principles and the suspect concept of mutual flourishing, they tell me. They allow the church to remain complementarian in its approach, requiring women to be gracious and grateful to be allowed offices in the church. And of course, if we try to read the 5 guiding principles as meaning that we legitimately share authority, then we're being extremist. So I want to look specifically at the 5 guiding principles and what they do to women's preaching. If you've done much study or reading about preaching, I guess that you've heard of people like Walter Brueggemann and Anna Carter Florence, and about ideas like the new homiletic. Well, arguably, the pioneer was Fred Craddock, and what he says about authority to preach is informative. This is what he says: authority is that which gives one the right to speak. It's ecclesiastical by reason of ordination. It's charismatic by reason of call. It's personal by reason of talent and education. It's democratic by reason of willingness of the listeners to give their attention. Authority to preach the gospel is located in ordination and in the willingness of listeners to give their attention. Arguably, that parallels the 5 guiding principles, which also imply that if someone does not recognize your ordination and is not willing to give you their attention, you have no authority. A similar thing happens in Walter Brueggemann's preaching triangle, where you've got the Bible, the congregation, and the preacher. And that, again, potentially silences women, because the Bible is assumed to be able to be read from nowhere. The congregation are seen as a homogeneous generic group, and the preacher is neutral, none of which I believe to be the case. The conference that I found the women at, the 66 women I spoke to, is a Women's Voices conference, which has been running for 13 years now, and it's happening in London in May, actually. But these women get together because I asked whether there was a need for women who preach to come and talk to each other about the experience without having to lay out the groundwork and persuade people that that's really what's happening. These are some quotes from my research. Your voice is too quiet. You're too high-pitched. Your voice doesn't carry as well as a man's. Your voice isn't natural for preaching like a man's. You're too loud. You sound too angry. If women learnt to speak more graciously, men might listen to them, you think. That's my personal favourite. The problem's clearly located in the woman and the woman's voice in these comments. But voice isn't just trained during formation. Voice is trained from early childhood. Women are taught to speak quietly and serenely. Voice is an example of formation, being in a wider context. The normative male voice and women's voices are lacking or other. In his book Alive to the Word, Stephen Wright says this: if a woman does have a quiet voice and is uncomfortable proclaiming a message from a high pulpit in a large church, yet has a clear call from God to share his word, would it not be better for both preacher and listeners to create spaces within the life of a church where she could feel at home? The problem's the woman and the woman's voice. Yet voice is socially conditioned and learnt. Women are taught to speak quietly and sweetly, according to Nancy Lammers Gross. One year, the Women's Voices Conference was based on the title #MeToo. This is some of the feedback from then. I don't like feminist shoutiness. It puts me off. If we want to win people over, we need to be gentle. If they use more feminine tones, perhaps people would listen. Again, the problem is not the injustice that the speakers were talking about. The problem is in the speaker's voice, in shouting, in being angry. That's the problem. Indeed, a third woman said, we need to be less angry. We're being policed. Women's voices are being policed, not just in the church, but in training institutions as well. Another woman was told after she led the 3-hour vigil for Good Friday, you remember Good Friday, that's the one where Jesus dies, that she needed to sound less mournful. Because women's voices are irksome to men when they sound sad. Surely that's an attempt, intentionally or otherwise, to change not only the woman's voice, but the way that she communicates her understanding of the crucifixion. Her voice, she said, was sad because it was the final talk before the passion and the reproaches. Mournfulness was appropriate, but the person commenting found it hard to hear a woman speaking mournfully. Again, the woman's voice was the problem. And representative voices are silenced too. One respondent said her vicar changed her Easter sermon to get rid of the women. Another says that she made what was taken to be a feminist point in her sermon and was taken to task by her training incumbent. And one of the speakers, Bishop Libby, in 2018 remembered realising that she'll never be a bishop, she'll always be a woman bishop, which immediately made her part of a subset. And I think there's a more sinister way of silencing women's representative voices too. In general, women train later for ordination. The church, therefore, invests less in their training, and as a result, they tend to train part-time. A knock-on effect of this is that most of the people in my research gained undergraduate qualifications, certificates, or diplomas rather than full degrees, which meant that when dioceses or education institutions looked for educational staff, the pool was overpopulated by men. In addition, because men often train full-time and residentially, they build networks not open to women who train part-time. They recognize each other and each other's training. Importantly, they are recognized by those who identify potential candidates for senior posts. Therefore, male priests dominate full-time stipendiary posts and senior posts. It's a system that's designed to silence women's voices. It can't do anything else. I've already said that based on my findings, the purpose of formation is to manufacture conformity. The model priest or lay reader to which ordinands and trainees must conform is by default male. Several of my respondents made comments like, formation's a bullying process. You're afraid to step out of line because they have power over you. Or, you're taught doctrine as though it's objectively true, and nobody stops to ask, what does that doctrine do to people? Another person, a tutor this time, talked about teaching a group of people doing level 4, introductory, Old Testament. She said she noticed that even though she was the expert in the room, with a higher degree and so on, some of the male students felt very free to interrupt her. And one day she co-taught with a male tutor who wasn't an expert in the field but was in the room. And together they counted the number of times that each was interrupted. And the non-expert male was not interrupted at all. And she was interrupted by 2 particular students several times in the course of the lecture. Another complaint from women students, which comes from various TEIs, is the lack of books by women on the bibliography of biblical modules. And one student told me that she'd raised this with the lecturer, and the lecturer had told her that women don't write books about the Bible. In a subsequent piece of research that was funded by Common Awards, I worked with some small groups of women only to find out how they'd like training to change. I worked with one Baptist institution and 3 Anglican ones. And 2 comments seemed to confirm the idea that women are expected to conform to male norms. One woman said, "I can cope with being an ordinand because I used to work in a bank, and I had to be a woman man there. But as a result of speaking with other women, I realized that that's not helpful. I need to be a woman priest, not a woman being a man priest." And another one commented somewhat more pithily, "I'm fed up of the Disneyfication of women in the church," which I quite liked, the Disneyfication of women. Other participants in my original research spoke about trying to contribute to classroom discussions and being silenced. One was talking about Valerie Sabing's idea and others that perhaps women's sins are different from men's sins. And she was told, "Oh, that's just like the old interview question, what are your weaknesses?" "Well, I'm a perfectionist." Another tried to explain the pain to her colleagues in the class of refusing to take the cup from her when she assisted at college communion. And the tutor, not fellow students, the tutor responded that it was only like him not being able to take communion with his best friend because his best friend was Roman Catholic. And more women spoke of instances like this where tutors and students, instead of listening to their pain and accepting their experiences, substituted their own experiences as though they were equal and the same. One of the most significant ways, though, of silencing women's resistant voices in preaching is ignoring Bible women, making them either saints or sinners. So that's why I've written a couple of books with my friend Kate Bruce on women in the Bible and suggested sermons to go with each of them. But the big question at the top of this paper is how stifling women's voices affects the proclamation of the gospel. So let me make some suggestions based on the 2 pieces of research that I've done. The key conclusion, and this is not unique to the UK, this also happens in the US and in Australia, the key conclusion is that women are not prepared by our training for ministry in the church as it is. We're not warned about the sexism that we might encounter, and we're not prepared to counter it, therefore. We're not told that we need a robust theology of gender equality. TEIs, Theological Education Institutes, it seems to me, collude in the lie that the church is equal because all mutually flourish. So my first proposal, and the one that the vast majority of my participants wanted, is to provide women-only spaces where women can talk freely during training and afterwards on the basis of mutual understanding about their experiences of training and ministry. Talk about the actual experience rather than having to lay the groundwork first and convince people that it genuinely happened. And then the second thing that I want to propose is that we reclaim the stories of Bible women. Too often, biblical studies is taught as though the male-centric approach is the norm, and feminist or womanist readings are other, or from the margins, or weird in some way. And even when feminist readings are included in teaching, they're add-ons rather than part of the mainstream teaching. I think that needs to change. And the third proposal I have is that women learn to preach as women, to speak from our own experiences, to admit that we experience sexism, because when we don't admit that, the women in the pews assume when it happens to them, that makes them weird. It happens to all of us, so we need to admit it and be honest about it. We need to talk about how we deal with those things. And then the women in the congregation might see that preaching is important and relevant. So in conclusion, I want to say that the 5 guiding principles and the patriarchy that they represent of the church stifle women's voices and prevent the proclamation of the full gospel. I concluded my first book, Preaching Women, like this, and I'm going to conclude this talk in this way as well. Developing women's preaching and women preachers is not simply about equality. It's much more important than that. It drives at the heart of God's self-revelation to and through humanity and God's performative grace in creation. When God's revelation is warped by exclusion or dismembered by suppression, all people suffer. The fullness of God's presence in our lives needs God's activity in both women and men to be manifest. Otherwise, both excluded women and exalted men suffer.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. As before, we'd love to have your questions, so do jot down and Kristen will collect them up. While you're doing that, I just want to reflect with you, Liz, that I was thinking the other day about this silencing of women in the church, and I was thinking about how silencing is an extreme act of violence when you stop and think about it. And I was thinking about how people got silenced in the past. I mean, literally had their tongues cut out if you said the wrong thing. Silencing is an extreme act of violence. And I just wanted to ask you, Liz, whether you think there's any understanding at all in the church of the violence and harm that is being done by silencing women.
There we go. This is working. I'm not sure there is any understanding about it at all. And it seems to me that it's a particularly important issue at the moment with events across the Atlantic and the rise of toxic masculinity here, because in certain areas of the church, let's not pretend toxic masculinity isn't present in the church, women are deliberately being silenced because that's the trajectory of society and the church, really. I've been doing some work on the Magnificat recently. The church really should be saying, no, that's not what we do. It's different. We should be listening to prophetic women, not shutting them up, I think. Yeah.
I've got some questions. Thank you all who are getting your questions in. Thank you very much. Is it helpful or unhelpful to have exclusive male-female prayer study social groups at parish level?
I suppose it depends who's in charge and what they do. I was part of a church where they did that, but unfortunately it was the men who decided what the women were going to talk about, which seemed to be undermine the thing, really. I think that it can be useful, and I think there needs to be some cross-fertilisation. Maybe the women could say, why don't you look at this? Actually, this is a story that you might like. In the first book that I wrote, Out of the Shadows, book 1, we suggested that churches, in the period when you can, did a little series on women in the Bible and preached about women in the Bible. And somebody I was in contact with went to her vicar, who was also a woman, and said, why don't we do 4 weeks out of 52, on women in the Bible? And this clergywoman said, oh, the men won't like that, they won't come. And I don't think that's actually true. But we've got another one? Yeah.
I don't know if you want to respond to this one, Martine.
Okay, so this is a question for me, really.
All right.
Stand.
You can sit down, Liz. You want me to stand up?
I do, yes.
Okay. So the question is, bearing in mind that marginalised groups face the same kind of issues, what is Watch doing to support other marginalised groups? Yeah, well, we're really angry about discrimination of all kinds, and fully support our allies who are focused on other areas of discrimination in the church. But we can't fight all battles at the same time, and so we do unashamedly have a focus and priority on trying to sort inequality for women in our church. We are 2/3 of the congregations of our church. If we can't get equality for women, what hope do we have of getting equality for people facing discrimination on other grounds?